The last winter. The wind howled across the frozen plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of another bitter night. Sarah clutched the bundle of firewood tighter against her chest, her knuckles white beneath worn gloves as she struggled against the gusting snow. Each step was a battle, her boots sinking into drifts that seemed determined to swallow her whole. "Come on, Sarah." Jake's voice cut through the storm, strong and reassuring despite the chaos around them. His weathered hand found her elbow, steadying her as she stumbled. "The cabin's just ahead, we're almost there." She looked up at him through wind-whipped strands of gray hair, finding comfort in his familiar face beneath the shadow of his black cowboy hat. Even after all these years, even in the midst of this nightmare, Jake Morrison remained her anchor. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of decades spent under the western sun, but it was the kindness there that had first captured her heart 37 years ago. "I can make it," she said, though her voice was barely audible above the storm. The lie came easily. She'd been telling variations of it for months now, ever since the diagnosis that had changed everything. They pushed forward together, their movements synchronized by years of partnership. The landscape around them was a study in desolation, endless white stretching toward a gray sky that seemed to press down upon the earth like a heavy blanket. This wasn't the gentle snow of Christmas cards or childhood memories. This was something else entirely, something that spoke of endings rather than beginnings. The storm had come out of nowhere, or so it seemed. They'd been checking the fence line on the north pasture when the sky had darkened with unnatural speed. What had started as a few scattered flakes had quickly become a full-scale blizzard, the kind that old-timers called a widow-maker, the sort that claimed lives and left families broken. But Jake knew better. He'd been watching the weather patterns for weeks, noting the unusual formations in the clouds, the way the animals had been acting. The horses had been restless, clustering together near the barn. The cattle had moved to lower ground without prompting. Even Rex, their old border collie, had been pacing the porch, whining at the horizon. "Should have listened to the dog," Jake muttered, adjusting his grip on Sarah's arm as they crested a small rise. "What?" Sarah asked, leaning closer to hear him. "Nothing, honey, save your breath." Ahead of them, barely visible through the swirling snow, the outline of the old hunting cabin emerged like a mirage. It wasn't much, a one-room structure that Jake's grandfather had built in the 1940s, but it represented salvation. Warmth, shelter, a chance to wait out the storm that threatened to consume them. Jake had insisted they maintain the cabin over the years, much to Sarah's occasional frustration. "It's just sitting there," she'd said more than once. "Taking up space, costing money for repairs." But Jake had been stubborn about it, driven by some instinct he couldn't quite name. Now, as they stumbled toward its promise of sanctuary, Sarah understood his wisdom. The door, painted red many seasons ago but now faded to the color of dried blood, stood slightly ajar. Snow had drifted against the threshold, creating a small barrier that Jake kicked aside with his boot. The hinges protested with a groan that seemed to echo their own exhaustion as he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, but it was shelter. Jake fumbled for the oil lamp he knew would be on the shelf beside the door, his fingers numb despite his gloves. The familiar weight of it in his hands was reassuring, a tangible connection to all the times he'd come here before, hunting trips with his father, stolen afternoons with Sarah in their younger days, quiet moments of solitude when the weight of running a ranch had threatened to crush him. "Here, let me get this fire started," he said, guiding Sarah to the old rocking chair that sat near the stone fireplace. She sank into it gratefully, still clutching the firewood like a lifeline. The cabin hadn't changed much over the years. A simple cot occupied one corner, covered with moth-eaten blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme. A small table and two chairs sat beneath the single window, and shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of camping supplies, tools, and the accumulated detritus of decades. Jake knelt before the fireplace, grateful to find kindling and newspaper still stacked beside the hearth. His movements were practiced, economical, the result of countless fires built in countless places over the course of his 64 years. The paper caught easily, and soon small flames were licking at the dry wood. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "That'll warm us up." Sarah watched the flames grow, mesmerized by their dance. The fire painted the cabin walls in shifting shades of gold and amber, banishing the cold gray light that had filtered through the window. For the first time in hours, she felt something approaching peace. "Do you remember," she said softly, "the first time you brought me here?" Jake smiled, settling beside her on the floor with his back against her chair. Summer of '88. You complained the whole time about the spider webs. They were everywhere, Sarah protested, but her voice held laughter. I swear that place hadn't been cleaned since your grandfather built it. Probably hadn't been, Jake admitted. But you stayed anyway. I stayed because of you. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of nearly 4 decades of marriage. They'd weathered so much together, the lean years when the ranch barely kept them afloat, the joy of building their life together, the sorrow of learning they couldn't have children, the gradual acceptance that what they had was enough. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended. The fire crackled and hissed, filling the small space with warmth and the comforting scent of burning pine. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself drift, remembering summers when they were young, when the future stretched ahead of them like an endless prairie. Jake, she said eventually, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear her. Yeah, I need to tell you something. He turned to look at her, noting the way the firelight played across her features, highlighting the silver in her hair and the fine lines that time had etched around her eyes. She was still beautiful to him, perhaps more so now than ever. Beauty, he'd learned, wasn't about youth or perfection. It was about the accumulation of shared moments, the deepening of connection that came with truly knowing another person. I know about Dr. Henderson, he said gently. Sarah's eyes flew open. What? The appointments, the tests. I may be old, but I'm not blind, Sarah. I've seen the way you've been looking at things lately. Like you're trying to memorize them. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. How long have you known? Couple months. I was going to wait for you to tell me when you were ready. He reached up and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. How bad is it? The question she'd been dreading, the one that had kept her awake nights staring at the ceiling, trying to find the words. 6 months, she whispered. Maybe less. Jake absorbed this information like he absorbed everything else, with the steady calm that had first drawn her to him. He didn't rage against the unfairness of it, didn't break down or demand answers from a universe that rarely provided them. He simply squeezed her hand and said, then we'll make them count. The simplicity of his response broke something loose in her chest, and the tears came then, hot and cleansing. He stood and gathered her into his arms, holding her as she wept for all the tomorrows they wouldn't have, all the sunrises they wouldn't see together. I'm scared, she admitted against his chest. I know, me too. They held each other as the fire burned and the storm howled, 2 people facing the ultimate uncertainty with nothing but their love to sustain them. Outside, the world was being transformed by ice and snow, but inside the cabin, something else was happening, a different kind of transformation, quieter but no less profound. Tell me about the ranch, Sarah said when her tears had subsided. Tell me what you're planning for spring. It was a gift she was giving him, this request.